Personal influence and conflict resolution. When considering communication, it's important to consider how it is created, and it's done through interpersonal influence. Interpersonal influence is about how people's reactions and responses are mediated by interpersonal communication with members of their social environment. This can be through messages, media, speaking with someone, or nonverbal communication. A person's identity and their place in relation to different member groups, such as family, friends, or workplace, has more influence on how a person makes a decision than most people are aware. So what shapes interpersonal influence? Well, interpersonal influence theory can be broken down into two types of goals. These goals are created on how they relate to people's lives, their identities, and their wants and needs. The two types of goals is part of a theory of communication called multiple goals theory. This is a theory for which people seek the compliance of others to obtain a personal goal, which is done through the influence or persuasion of others using communication tactics and strategies. Multiple goals theory can be defined when you consider that when you're interacting and communicating with each other, it isn't solely done in order to achieve one single end. Instead, effective communication is the employment of a number of different ways of interacting, and they're all combined to achieve a specific goal. Think about when you're speaking with someone. You're not just saying words in a specific manner. You have body language, expressions, tone of voice, raising, and they are all combined in order to achieve what you want. So to understand multiple goals theory, we go back to the type 2 goals, primary and secondary. Primary goals are done in order to gain assistance, give advice, share activity, change orientation, change a relationship nature, obtain permission from someone, or to enforce your rights, obligations, or even your wants or needs. Whereas secondary goals, there are 5: identity, conversation, management, relational resource, personal resource, and effect management. Identity goals are based on the primary goal. Without the primary goal, there is no secondary goal. And they are based on the person's idea of self and related to their identity. Conversation management goals are about how the individual behaves around others. Interestingly, these goals, both primary and secondary, may conflict with one another and may change over time. In a relationship, as the individual seeks to influence the other, they will look to familiar plans and actions first. But if those plans and actions do not meet their needs, they will change. Burleson argues that there are 3 major points concerning multiple goals theory. One is that communication is intentional. It is on purpose. We don't simply exchange information or data just for the sake of exchanging. Instead, we do it in order to achieve a specific social goal. That in order for this goal to be executed, it requires more than the one person that's communicating it has, so it involves more people, at least 2. However, one caveat is that we are not always conscious of the goals that we have in mind when we pursue these social goals. The second is that communicators often pursue multiple goals at the same time. Different types of social goals are instrumental goals, or objectives that are related to overcoming an obstacle or a problem, and that's maybe blocking the completion of the goal. The second is relational goals. These are objectives related to creating and keeping the relationship with the other person. And lastly, identity goals. These are related to the goals of creating and figuring out the way that our individual and other personalities exist. The third point of the multiple goals theory is that communication requires the managing and multitasking of conflicting aims, either simultaneously or consecutively, and that conflicts that occur socially are when 2 or more parties perceive that they have either competing or conflicting aims and goals. For example, when communication interactions become very complex, these complex situations are most likely to elicit differences in how participants exert their influence, and they also challenge the parties involved with how they understand and comprehend meaning from the message of the other party. When examining conflict, When examining conflict in close relationships, there are four particular emotions that emerge during this conflict. Usually it's anger, jealousy, hurt, or guilt. Conflict is often seen as a negative event. Conflict as positive versus a negative behavior, and conflict as a strategic orientation in order to achieve something greater. Reaching an understanding in conflict is more likely to occur when at least one person possesses an empathetic ear or empathetic accuracy and assumed similarity. Empathetic accuracy is an individual's ability to infer the other person's thoughts and feelings correctly. Assumed similarity is the extent to which one's rating of the other partner coincides or matches up with how one feels with the same emotion. Personal influence is important in conflict resolution. Since personal influence has the power of individuals to sway or control the decisions of others, and can be external or internal, it involves social interaction between these people, and it occurs when decisions are influenced by mental processes. When conflict arises, there are different people's ways of approaching resolutions, and strategies are the way that they do it. Some approaches consist of tactics that institute several strategies: negotiation, direct face to face honoring tactics, accepting a responsibility, proposing a change, attempt at reconciliation, or direct fighting and arguing. This involves direct and face attacking behaviors, blaming the other person, interrupting them, confronting them, but it can also occur in a non confrontational manner and still be a conflict. Other domains can also complement the conflict. Supportive messages and conflict messages oftentimes will work independently to predict a relationship satisfaction level. Supportiveness can, in fact, limit the effects of the negative conflict, and using more supportive behavior rather than unsupportive works to help people in their conflict management. People find that when they overcome a problem together, that their level of relationship is actually better. In fact, lack of supportive behavior increases the negative emotions that are associated during the conflict and after with the relationship. To give an example, the textbook states that as a satisfied couple reports lower levels of conflict and higher levels of support, but the opposite, more conflicts and not enough support, has been linked to lower levels of well-being. There are also positive outcomes of conflict. There are lots of research on the negative aspects. However, there are positive ones also, which can lead to positive individual and relationship outcomes. If conflict is dealt with in a healthy manner, for instance, communicating ideas effectively, being assertive but respectful, listening attentively, and also being willing to deliberate in order to find a solution, conflict also can end up strengthening relationships. General family norms are born out of the continuous use of conflict strategies. Think about it. Your family, you're always fighting, but at the end of the day, your bond is solid. This is why it is important that parents establish positive conflict strategies early in order to set the tone for their children. Furthermore, early positive parent-child conflict interactions can lead to positive behavioral and developmental outcomes for the child later in life. When considering conflict, you have to also consider the consideration of multiple relationships. It's important to consider the influence that other relationships might influence the complex process of conflict in close relationships. For example, adolescents who experience high conflict with their best friends and their parents showed poor social functioning because the two were somehow interlinked. What is important to remember is that research in conflict communication provides us with needed information on how people interact with one another, how this in turn affects their relationship, and how they relate to other people. There are 5 common strategies that people use when dealing with conflict resolution: avoiding, accommodating, collaborating, competing, and compromising. Avoiding is when people either avoid or withdraw from communication even taking place. This is usually chosen when the person or people involved in the conflict cannot even handle the potential discomfort that conflict may bring. Though it might seem at first as an easier way to accommodate the potential individual causing the strife, nothing of value is usually contributed to the conversation, and it also has the potential to create further communication problems in the future. Nothing ends up being resolved, and the problem is usually still there. Accommodating. This is another way of dealing with conflict. Usually happens when one party gives in to the other person or the demands of them, or even more people. The person is usually cooperative and not assertive. To some, this could appear as being polite or nice or gracious. However, accommodating to simply preserve peace and keep the conversation and others going can result in unresolved issues. And this strategy usually ends up with one person in a group commandeering the entire communication process and creates an atmosphere where usually more conflicts will follow. Competing. This is another way of dealing with conflict. It's adopted usually by individuals who seek to win their argument at all costs or be held as the winner. This behavior and means of communicating is often seen as aggressive, and they lack any sense of compromise, empathy, or cooperation among the parties involved. This strategy is defined by the notion that during the conflict, one side wins, but everybody else loses. It allows no other perspectives or viewpoints and is not considered a good way of resolving conflict. When people feel as if they aren't being listened to or that they are being bullied into a corner, this is when communication usually stops altogether. Collaborating. This is the method used when people are both assertive of their opinions, ideas, and issues, but they're also willing to cooperate. They listen to others and they give their ideas and opinions willingly. This type of strategy allows groups with issues to have each person contribute equally, with the possibility of creating a solution to the conflict that everyone involved is happy with. Similar in some ways to collaborating, however, is compromising. This is when people involved are maybe only partially assertive and partially cooperative. This strategy involves everybody giving up a little bit of what they want, and no one gets everything they want. The best way to describe it is splitting the difference. It's often perceived as fair, though not everyone will be happy with the final outcome necessarily. Communicating effectively with others is a complex process. It involves the culmination of many working parts, working together to achieve multiple social goals such as trust, values, intimacy, dependability, and many more relationship-based goals. How we as individuals perceive meaning and attribute value is not necessarily the same as somebody else would. To be better communicators, it's important to understand your audience, how you are being perceived, and have a clear understanding of your goal. After all, the way you think you're coming across may not be the way the other person sees you. So now we have some questions for you to consider. Do you find that people are losing the ability to understand when they interact face to face? So much of our communication today is happening digitally through the internet, SMS, online. That visual communication has potentially become more difficult. What do you think? Another thing to think about is, what are some effective strategies that you have used when confronted with a communication problem or maybe a conflict?